Good morning. It's a daunting thing to speak to a bunch of people who had that much sugar 45 minutes ago and might be crashing. One of the things that I hope at some restaurants, they close the original, which I actually made a trek to occasionally just because I wanted to eat at the original Jimmy's Egg. But I was first introduced to Jimmy's Egg in Edmond, Oklahoma, and I ordered just as soon as I saw it on the menu, I knew I had to have it. And it was the garbage breakfast. The garbage breakfast. Now, there's some things about the garbage breakfast that you should know. As it is on the menu, it's a bed. They've got a mix together of sausage crumbles and peppers and onions and all kinds of just good stuff. And then on top of that, they've got eggs, however you want, just thrown over the top. And then you can eat it with ketchup or whatever else you want to throw on it. And they call it the garbage breakfast. I just don't understand why. But when Melody looks at what I do to the garbage breakfast, and I go after all the eggs with the knife and the fork, and then I dab ketchup all over it, Melody looks at it, and she does not see the wonder and the splendor that I see in front of me. She sees garbage. And the reality is, we don't always see the same thing. We don't always recognize even what we're looking at. And sometimes humans confuse things. And what seems like garbage might be really, really good. And what might seem really, really good at the time might be garbage. That's not what I'm here talking about today, though. Let's think about something else. I'll come back to that later. Way back in our John discussion, and we keep going back to John, we learned something about John. When the Apostle John started his writing, it takes us back, as we've said, to Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. And he encapsulates the idea of God being both transcendent, being able to speak everything into existence, and immanent, being able to be right in the thick of things. Genesis 2, forming, planning. And I've said this many times up here, and I don't think I'll get tired of saying it. But I want to talk about what it says about the character of God. That from the very beginning, the earliest stories in the text from the very beginning says God is never satisfied to stay somewhere distant from his people. God is never satisfied to be kept apart from his people. He longs for his people. In Isaiah, we read that he longs for his people like a woman longs for a baby when it's crying and she needs to feed it. That's how God sees his people. And even from the first sin in the text, what we see is not that God just sees that they sin and that's it for them, but that God goes looking for them. He pursues them in the garden, and he deals with them. I want to go back to the transfiguration that we talked about last week. And so we're going to be back several times to this. So if you'll just open your Bibles to Luke 9, 28. And it goes through about 36. But we're going to take piece by piece and look at this. Luke 9, 28 through 31 says this. About 8 days after Jesus said this, he took Peter, John, and James with him and went up onto a mountain to pray. As he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became as bright as a flash of lightning. 2 men, Moses and Elijah, appeared in glorious splendor, talking with Jesus. They spoke about his departure, which he was able to bring to fulfillment at Jerusalem. They spoke about his departure, your NIV reads. And yet that's not specifically the word in Greek, because we don't read Greek, most of us. But the word is Exodus. He spoke of his Exodus. They told Jesus about his Exodus, which he was about to bring to fulfillment at Jerusalem. Now, understand the Old Testament is Hebrew, but the Greek word from the Hebrew translated into the Septuagint, which the New Testament writer had, used the word Exodus. And we render it departure because that's what we learned when we were 3 or 4 years old in Bible class. Exodus means going out, right? Departure. But less than half of the book of Exodus is about leaving. And there's so much more to the book of Exodus than just the leaving of Egypt. So when they spoke to Jesus about his departure, which he was about to bring to fulfillment at Jerusalem, I want us to read that. They spoke to him about his exodus, which he was about to bring to fulfillment at Jerusalem. So what was about to be fulfilled? I don't think it was his leaving. More than half of Exodus is about the tabernacle. More than half of Exodus is about the tabernacle and the dwelling place of God and everything that's supposed to be done in the tabernacle. And so I want you to imagine the writer in the New Testament saying, Luke saying, look backwards, right? Look at what's in front of you. And when they tell Jesus about his Exodus, they're saying to Jesus, look back at the Exodus and how you are in Exodus. And you are the tabernacle. And you're going to fulfill what the tabernacle was in God's mind from the beginning. And things point to things, which point to things, which point to things. And so let's just do this for fun. Let's go back from Jesus, Mount of Transfiguration, that's a mouthful, to Exodus, and to the tabernacle. And now let's say, what does the tabernacle point to? And scholars are unified on this. The tabernacle was a mobile reminder, a mobile retelling of the creation of the world. 7 times in the discussion about the creation of the tabernacle, 7 times God said to Moses, introduces the next section, the next thing. 7 times. The 7th thing in the temple, in the tabernacle instructions, is the Sabbath regulations. And you have all of these parallels, like the Holy of Holies being like the Garden of Eden, where most people had to stay out of that all the time, and only once a year could the high priest enter, even to there. And it's interesting that the same phrase that you heard read earlier today, Moses finished his work and then he blessed the temple or the tabernacle. He blessed the tabernacle and they went about their celebrations. It's the same phrasing used in Genesis when God looked at what he'd made. He finished his work and he blessed it. And he gave it a real focus. So the reality is that God in Eden had said, I'm going to make a dwelling place for you and for me. I'm going to create a dwelling place, and God told them, you fill it. You reign over it. You rule it. You run it. You're going to be fruitful. You're going to multiply. You're going to reign over it, and I will dwell there with you. So God in Eden said, I'll make it. You fill it. So how did that go? Well, God made a dwelling in Eden. But his creation, his creatures, decided to take what wasn't given. They wanted glory to be like God. They wanted glory on their terms. It didn't work out very well. And much of the rest of Genesis is about how badly it worked out. But when we get to the end of the Genesis or the Exodus narrative, where we end up with like the 10 Commandments right around Exodus 20, everything else in Exodus is about the tabernacle. And it's as if God says, you know what? You make it. I'll fill it. In Exodus 25, 1 through 9, the Lord said to Moses, tell the Israelites to bring me an offering. You're to receive the offering from me, from everyone whose heart prompts them to give. Then have them make a sanctuary for me, and I will dwell among them. Make this tabernacle and all its furnishings exactly like the pattern I will show you. This is very specific. If you've been reading along, if you try to read the Bible through in a year, you get to all of Genesis and halfway through Exodus, and then it's like you drive into a tar pit, right? From an earthly standpoint. all of a sudden the cool stories go away, and you start reading about what the lampstands are made out of, and really well sewn fabrics, and all these different gemstones, and all this different thing. And as you get all the way through the sevenfold regulations for how to craft the tabernacle, and you get to the end of that, you start to get a little narrative, and it gets interesting again for a minute, and then they do all of the regulations and instructions for the tabernacle. How to do it, right? And then they tell you exactly what they did. All again. It was not easy for them to write all that down. They didn't have AI to just kind of throw it all and copy and paste, right? They had to laboriously write it down and keep it exactly like it was, and then do it all again exactly like it was. It makes, from a human perspective, very little sense to have to say it twice. Well, we'll go back to that. God's glory came to the tabernacle. Just like God's glory was in Eden, it was in Eden. Wow, I'm having trouble talking today. It was in Eden. God's glory comes in a special way to the tabernacle. Exodus 40, 34 through 38. You don't need to turn there. But Moses sets up the courtyard around the tabernacle and altar, puts up the curtain at the entrance to the courtyard. And so he finished the work. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses couldn't enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. In all the travels of the Israelites, whenever the cloud lifted from above the tabernacle, they would set out. But if the cloud did not lift, they did not set out until the day it lifted. So the cloud of the Lord was over the tabernacle by day, and the fire was in the cloud by night, in the sight of all the Israelites during all of their travels. God said, you make it, I'll fill it. They made it. He filled it. Right? In a visible way, in an overwhelming way, he filled it. How did that go? Well, they had guidance, followed by murmuring. You remember murmuring, right? When you were a little kid, murmur, right? And major missteps. But you know, the tabernacle was at least God's idea. I say that way on purpose. What replaced the tabernacle? Somebody just shouted out. What replaced the tabernacle? The temple, right? We were all told that, right? We were all told the temple replaced the tabernacle. And by the way, somebody couldn't build the tabernacle, or the temple rather, because he'd lived a violent life and he had not done right by God. And so I want to get into this just for a minute. The temple was David's idea. The temple was David's idea. It was David's dream. If you recall, one evening he was basically just enjoying his fine palace made of cedar, and he looks around and says, how am I in this fine palace? And the Lord is just over in a tent, right? And that bothered him. And we think, well, man, after God's own heart. Clearly, he's got the mind of God. And I don't think so. He says, I'm in this fine palace, and God's in a tent. There's a problem here. And Nathan comes to him, and Nathan starts talking to him. And in 2 Samuel 12 through 14, here's what Nathan says. I've given you the wrong deal there. 2 Samuel 7, 12 through 14, I think. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with a rod wielded by men, with floggings inflicted by human hands. Was the prophecy given by Nathan to David about the building of a house for God fulfilled by Solomon building the temple? Was it fulfilled? David thought so. Jews thought so. Many Jews. Rabbis have begun to rethink this a lot. Interestingly enough, the temple was never God's idea. The tabernacle was God's idea. And I'm here to tell you, David did not, if you know your text, did not do his best thinking at night in his palace. Right? The reality is, David decided God needed more. And David decided to give something more. Solomon's temple was built. David had pretty much done everything but put the key in at the end by the time he died. But Solomon's temple was built. And it's interesting that the glory of God came into that temple. But that temple is marked by destruction, soon and later. Over and over, the temple would be destroyed. And interestingly enough, in spite of what many people think, there is no mention of ever rebuilding the temple of Solomon. There's no mention of that in the text. One of the misuses of an Acts text about the rebuilding of a temple for God is David's fallen tent, which was David's tent of praise, which wasn't the tabernacle, but it was a place where all nations from all the world could gather in David's kingdom and worship Yahweh. That is said it will be rebuilt. But when we hear what God says through Nathan to David, he says, your own flesh and blood is going to build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. How is that fulfilled? Well, it's fulfilled in Jesus. Jesus is the fulfillment of that prophecy. Jesus is the one for us that God says, I'll become you. And then I'll make you anew. And then I'll fill you with my glory. Jared made a comment, quote from Chad Bird, the idea that even in Eden, when breath of life is being put into the man that God had formed, that you can almost hear and see that it's beginning to look a lot like Christmas, as you know, if you're looking, that God is saying, someday I will be the next Adam. Someday I will be the creature. John 1:14, we've read it and read it and read it. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. And that actually, the phrase there is, the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father full of grace and truth. John says, we've seen his glory. What glory? Luke 9:34 through 35, back to the transfiguration. While he was speaking, a cloud appeared and covered them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. And a voice came from the cloud saying, this is my Son, whom I have chosen. Listen to him. And when the voice had spoken, they found Jesus was alone. Glory filled Jesus. And his face shone like Moses, and his face shone like the fire in the cloud at night over the tabernacle. Interestingly, the same story about the grand opening of the tabernacle is told again for the temple. When they finished the tabernacle, Moses and Aaron put the offering on the altar and then stepped back. And God brought fire and consumed the offering. And his glory filled the space. And it says that people fell face down, but they shouted for joy. When Solomon completed the temple, he laid the altar, on the altar he laid the gift. And he stepped back. And God sent fire to consume the offering. sometimes God works with what we do. And so I don't think that it's wrong for us to imagine that if David really had a heart for God and really wanted to build God a temple and replace the tabernacle with the temple, it seems clear based on how God then deals with David and gives instructions and gives guidance, that God says, fine, have it your way, build me a temple. But it's always about Jesus. Glory never came when the temple was rebuilt after the Babylonian captivity. The glory never returned. When Herod worked and all the construction was done to make the temple this amazing thing during the time of Jesus' day, it was missing the glory of God. We sing a song where a phrase is, in the darkness we were waiting without hope, without light. Right? It's the song King of Kings. In the darkness we were waiting without hope, without light. You know, we really don't know when Jesus was born. I know y'all know that. But Jesus was born in the winter, surely. Maybe not in the season of winter. But if you've ever seen any of the great epic stories, it's always winter and night before the king comes, right? Jesus was definitely born in the winter. So back to the double telling of the tabernacle specifics in Exodus. Anytime that you've got a telling of something, and then you have space, and then you have the telling of the exact same thing. We've talked before about how that is very likely a sandwich, right? Where the instructions are here, and that's like the bread, and the instructions are here, and that's like the bread, and it's calling you, telling you, look what's in the center. And what's in the center? Let's bookend. Well, it's a garbage sandwich. It's a garbage sandwich. It's garbage like Melody thinks my garbage breakfast is. Not what I think it is. The problem is, people didn't look at it and think this is garbage. Moses is with God on the mountain. He's got the tablets. He's ready to go. And God says to Moses, all right, now go. Your people, right? Kind of like we as parents do, right? Your child, right? Your people, Moses, they are up to no good. And he sends Moses down to find Aaron, his brother, who he had no good reason to have, right, with him, right? Except that he wouldn't listen to God in the first place and just go by himself, right? Aaron has fashioned a golden calf, right? And he said, this is the God that's rescued you from Egypt. Right in the middle of God's big plan and foreshadowing of Messiah, it gets interrupted. His dwelling gets absolutely defiled by a golden calf, which seemed at one point like a pretty good idea at the time. It's a garbage sandwich. We'll probably come back to that. God made a dwelling in Eden. His creation decided to take what wasn't given. Adam and Eve wanted glory on their terms. God was giving a lasting covenant through Moses on Sinai, and people decided to bring God to themselves on their terms. What we see is not always what God sees. David wanted a house for God on his terms. God accommodated him, but he promised much more. Back to the transfiguration, the middle part. Luke 9, 32 through 33 says this. Peter and his companions were very sleepy. But when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the two men standing with him. As the men were leaving Jesus, Peter said to him, Master, it's good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. He did not know what he was saying. Anybody just wondered about that? Some scholars think, well, maybe it's during the Feast of Tabernacles when they're remembering the wanderings in the desert. And Peter's just like, more people, we've got to have more tents. Maybe. But Jesus is the very presence of the glory of God. And Peter's initial reaction was to build 3 tents to house the revealed glory of God. In the darkness, they were waiting. The light had not come back to the temple. The glory had not come back to the temple. Peter sees glory, right? And he says, we need a tent. We need 3 tents. It's backwards thinking. It's hard to blame. Because sometimes we see the glory of God, or we get the revelation of something, we have an aha moment, and then we go, oh! And then we don't respond in a way that in eternity makes a bit of sense. Because we say, I got it, God, I'm going to do it just exactly the way I want to in response to what you say. Ever do that? Ever build a garbage sandwich out of what God gives you at your beginning and end? I have. When Jesus appeared to Peter by the lake after the resurrection, John 21, he wouldn't even let Peter make him breakfast. Right? He wouldn't even let him pick up the tab at the Jimmy's Egg there by Galilee. Peter gets out of the boat and runs to Jesus. But Jesus says, I got your breakfast right here. Peter didn't even get to clean the fish they just caught. Jesus says, I've got this covered. And I wonder, was that meager meal of some fish satisfying to Peter? Was it enough? Right? Or did he go, oh, I got here just a little bit late and I didn't even get any of the fish. Sorry, that's an inside joke for those who showed up a little late. Or even on time. We're still short on Wednesday. Jesus already cooked what was needed. Breakfast came on his terms. David had wanted a house for God on his terms. God accommodated him. But as I said, he promised much more. What did God promise? You heard read Jeremiah 3, 14 through 16. Return, faithless people, declares the Lord, for I am your husband. I will choose you. In those days, people will no longer say the ark of the covenant of the Lord. It will never enter their minds or be remembered. It will not be missed, nor will another one be made. Right? That's what he says is going to happen to the ark. And if you're an Indiana Jones fan, you know this already, right? There it is, off in some warehouse somewhere. Glory will come on God's terms. And he's always got a plan. Revelation 21, 1 through 3. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city and the new Jerusalem coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. And they will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. That's Revelation 21, 1 through 3. Jesus didn't need Peter to build him a tent. God does not need us to build him a temple. He already has one. It's the body of Jesus. It's his church. He doesn't need more things. He needs us to want less things. He tells us to clear out space for him. He has the design already in place. Every necessary detail is worked out. And yet, we, as a vessel, may be just filling it with garbage. It's a busy season. How can you make room for Jesus? How can you have less so that he can be more? This is a giving season. How can you honor the one who gave you life? See, I don't think David was doing something wrong that night in his palace, looking out and saying, how can I be in a palace and God be in that poor king? But I think God would have been far more interested in David thinking about his palace and his place and his pride and all of the different things that he'd done, and try and put himself in a position to approach God in a tent, rather than try and artificially create a space which could be elevated, much like you try and make something good enough for God and you define that as better than what I have. God wants it on his terms. God's dwelling place will, in the resurrection, be fully with man, and a new heaven and a new earth come together. That's what it says in Revelation. But Revelation is not just future, it's the revealed now. The New Jerusalem is, in a very real sense, coming down. The new heaven, the new earth, very real, very present in the people of God now. The dwelling place. And God says, I will fill it with my glory. And we're told by Paul that our faces should shine like the face of Jesus as we reflect his glory. People should see us, and the reflection should see so bright that they figuratively, if not literally, fall on their faces and praise God in heaven, or at least see our good works and give thanks to God, as Jesus said. The reality is, now we are the dwelling place. We have to make space. We have to make space. He won't clutter up our lives with more stuff if we just see his stuff. We have to move things out of the way and create a space for God in our lives. I don't know what that looks like for you. I think I know a little bit about what it looks like for me. But every one of us has a choice whether we want to be filled up with or whether we just want a big mess of stuff. Nobody really knows what to make of unless they like that sort of thing. We're going to go to the table here in just a few minutes. When we do, I'm just going to ask that you be thinking about how in your meditation that you can see this space as the New Jerusalem. That you can see this space as part of the new heaven and the new earth brought down. And it's not about the carpet, and it's not about the sound system, it's not about all those other things, because God's not good with the tent. In fact, he says, I'm good with just the people that are in it. Make room. If you need prayers, we'll have an opportunity for that at the end. Let's stand and sing.